This is Duke University.
Yeah. Eric, you're a real life G for this one. Yeah.
Welcome to Left of Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal, and we're joined this afternoon by Dean A Powery, who is the new Dean of the Chapel here at Duke University. Also the first Black Dean of the Chapel at Duke University, coming to us from Princeton University most recently, and the author of the new book, Dem Dry Bones, Preaching Death and Hope. How are you doing today, Dean Powery?
I'm doing well today.
Talk a little bit about, this new move for you, for folks who aren't in university environments, what exactly does a Dean of the Chapel do? On some level, that you're the chaplain for the university.
Exactly. That's a good synopsis. In this particular case here at Duke, it's really multi-layered. There is obviously a pastoral function. Sunday mornings here at Duke Chapel are put on blast on YouTube, our Sunday morning services.
I know they're the most watched thing at Duke University on YouTube.
I'm learning. But then there's also obviously one-on-one meetings for students, mentoring, people who want, care and counseling, hospital visitation. I've done that. Also, we have various student programs that are geared, to connect students to the community. We are now facilitating also and trying to grow the interfaith engagement and trying to facilitate conversation between various religions. There is also, I have a teaching appointment as well in the Divinity School as an associate professor of the practice of homiletics. And so there's a desire to continue my scholarship and writing and reflection. So it's all, just many layers, and you feel pulled in many different directions by many kinds of people.
And you say,
well.
A professor of practice of homiletics. You teach preaching.
I teach preaching, yeah. But now I have to show my stuff on Sunday morning.
I think about your colleague Jonathan Walton, who essentially just same position at Harvard University. How significant it is to have, a Black, chaplain at major universities like a Harvard. And in fact, Jonathan Walton was coming after, was already a Black chaplain at Harvard. What does it mean to have this kind of position at these elite schools?
Yeah, I think it's great significance. I think for me, what has hit home for me upon my arrival is recognizing that next year is the 50-year commemoration of integration at Duke and the convergence of my arrival.
Of inclusion, yes.
Yeah, and this celebration, commemoration, maybe lament in some ways as well. It's humbling, to be honest, but a recognition that I have not arrived. I stand on the shoulders of so many others who have paved the way here and, outside of Duke and in the Durham community, to have people who I don't even know stop me and say, you don't know what this means. Yeah. So a sense of humility, but also responsibility, I would say, to those that come behind me to create opportunities that perhaps have not been there, access to resources that may not have been there before, and so I'm taking all of this in, but I'm grateful. I am grateful and privileged to be here, and we'll see what the future holds.
You're watching Left of Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're here with Dean A Powery, who's the new Dean of the Chapel here at Duke University, the author of the new book, Dem Dry Bones, Preaching Death and Hope. Talk a little bit about the book.
Yeah, this book, which is my new one, came out this summer, is really trying to take the spirituals, African American spirituals, and interface them with contemporary homiletics. So, and to ask the question, what do the spirituals teach us about preaching? What do they teach us about death and hope? And what is ironic is there are obviously historical works, musicological works, even some works in theology on the spirituals. But even in light of the rich kind of historical connection between the spirituals, creation of the spirituals, and in-tone preaching within slavery, the irony is no one has taken up the spirituals for contemporary purposes, for preaching, thinking about it in relation to preaching. So I hope that's one piece of contribution that this work will make.
How much of that do you think can be attributed to the relationship that spirituals have to contemporary gospel music today, and some contemporary black churches? You don't normally hear the spirituals in black churches anymore. And at least growing up listening to them myself, I mean, what I always valued in it, they told stories. It was, high-level storytelling about our spiritual lives. And much of gospel music has gotten away from that storytelling. It's doing a different kind of labor. And so how much of that inability to connect these spirituals to a contemporary preaching tradition, is really about the fact that these spirituals no longer circulate in the church the way they used to?
Yeah, I think that's exactly the case. Where there's much highlight, obviously, on the commodification and commercialization of gospel music, etc. And even I hear people talking about jazz and even the blues, less so, but the spirituals are forgotten. There is some kind of cultural amnesia in many ways, even though the spirituals are the very foundation of all of these genres and the preaching tradition.
Right.
It's so integrated.
Even forms of hip hop.
Yeah, even forms of hip hop, exactly. And so my hope is to reclaim them for contemporary purposes as it relates to preaching and worship, and weave them in sermons, have the congregation in Duke Chapel singing a spiritual, as the choir does already, and has been doing, even this past Sunday. In thinking about the tragedy that recently happened in Connecticut, at the beginning of the service was basically a memorial. But what did the choir sing from the aisles as a procession of roses happened? There is a balm in Gilead. And I think the beauty of the spirituals, I mean, Du Bois would say the spirituals, are the most beautiful expression, human expression across the seas. And I think the beauty and the miracle of these spirituals is that knowing out of which the enslaved context of which they arose, yet they're speaking universally, still to this day, in Duke Chapel.
You talk about this connection between spirituals and other genres of black musical expression. And, if there's one thing, there's a kind of common link. We think about the blues, think about spirituals, some forms of hip hop, this ability to name evil in the world. And, we're experiencing as a nation some real evil at this particular moment. For you, at some place like Duke Chapel, and a very, very diverse audience that you're going to see every Sunday. What kind of challenge is it, to go into the pulpit, after a tragedy like we've seen at Newtown Elementary School, and try to find some way, to get people to be able to process what's happening, but to also find some sort of spiritual grounding, that allows them to have the faith to go forward.
Yeah, I think it is a challenge. In Duke Chapel, every Sunday is a challenge.
And we'll talk about that also.
But I would say, because of the cross-section of people, denominationally, generationally, culturally, to how does one say a word that may not be, that is not deemed politically partisan, playing sides, which I said on Sunday, I mean, taking up the question that came out of this particular passage, John in the wilderness, and the crowds asking, what should we do? That was the question I left them with, is what should we do in the face of, this violence, obviously the second worst school shooting in U.S. history, but we know brothers and sisters are being killed on the streets every day. There's no media attention, but this kind of gun violence and threat of violence has been going on and on. It's not anything new. It is a tragedy because of children, 6 and 7 year olds like my son.
Right.
And the massacre of the innocents that we have seen. I think the challenge was to raise the question, to name the truth of the violence that happened. I attempted to do that, and to raise that question, what should we do in the face of this? But also realizing and trying to make the connection. I think the Christmas Eve service I have to preach at, I'll make a greater connection, but pointing to this, the irony of this season is the season when we are anticipating or celebrating the birth of a child.
Yeah.
And here we're thinking about and lamenting the deaths of so many children, which also, there was a historic massacre of innocents. King Herod, when Jesus was born, he was in the pursuit to kill him, the so-called Messiah, but he ordered all children under 2 to be killed. And so today's, or the Friday massacre, converges with this historic massacre. But seeing the child, even the Christ child in this case, that this season is the time when, even though there is violence against children in many forms, even as we've seen most poignantly in Connecticut, this is still the season where we are asked, invited, to kneel at the side of a manger, to be led by a child. This child who promises that there will be one day that there will be no more mourning and no more death and no more senseless shootings. What a child represents, tragedy we have seen, but in this case also this sense of hope and newness and possibility. So I mean, those are some of the things I think that I tried to say in different ways, even in a statement yesterday. It's on our website. So it's, time for reflection, but hopefully action as well.
Yeah. You're watching Left of Black. We're here with Dean Luke Powery, who's the new Dean of the Chapel here at Duke University. Also the author of the new book, Dem Dry Bones, Preaching Death and Hope. We're talking about the Newtown Elementary School shootings and a few other things this afternoon. You mentioned some of the challenges of preaching at Duke Chapel, and I remember, when it was announced that you were coming on board, and I went to YouTube and found a couple of sermons. I'm like, okay, this cat got some skill, and so I was wondering about that, and I've been fortunate a few times to see our colleague Maurice Wallace, also in the pulpit in Duke Chapel, but I also know what Duke Chapel looks like. Right. on some Sunday mornings.
Sure.
And so there's obviously a learning component here, right? You're introducing to an audience that might not be as familiar with a certain kind of preaching style that's coming from a certain kind of tradition.
Yes.
And so what is it like on a Sunday morning, on the one hand trying to teach some folks, but actually hoping that there's some folks in the audience, because it's, that call and response thing is about you want to get back as much as you're giving in the pulpit. And sometimes I imagine you might scan that audience and might not see the possibilities for that on some Sunday mornings.
Yes, sir. I do, but I think it's an educational moment. I mean, what you said is a teaching moment. I hope what I bring to the pulpit is to teach and show another way of the proclamation, but also, Duke Chapel is listed as interdenominational, and I'm hoping, coming out of a holiness Baptist-costal, ordained Baptist from a Pentecostal background, a sense of the fullness of all expressions, within God's kingdom. And so to live into that interdenominationalism in a greater way, to live into our intergenerational, to live into our interracial. And I'm being very explicit about crossing these boundaries, border crossing, whether it's in the pulpit, and quoting Mahalia Jackson like this past Sunday, or singing. I mean, there's been a lot of questions. Sometimes I sing a piece of a sermon or even a benediction. I've done, So there's been a lot of questions about that, and I see it as a teaching moment.
Yeah.
About the musicality of preaching, and preaching being oral, not something that is imprisoned on a page.
Yeah.
And it's something that happens in our bodies.
Yeah.
And I think I really see it as a time to, really share some of my own philosophy of preaching, but cultural history,
Yeah.
and, all of that, our understanding of God and how big God is. So I'm hoping to continue down that path. But I would say people are responding. I mean, laughter is one that you hear in Duke Chapel, right? Maybe it's laughing to keep from crying, but there's a sense that people, you hear sometimes there is the what I call the Presbyterian amen. It may not be the extroverted, somebody saying amen, preach it, pastor, but there is a response happening. But I think even that, what are all of the expressions one may bring to express their praise or lament before God? I think even that is, is the possibility there pedagogically is present. So
we're here in North Carolina. Gardner Taylor.
Oh yeah,
is here in North Carolina.
Yes, he is.
And he's generally regarded as one of America's greatest preachers, not just Black Americans, like America's greatest preachers. So who are some of your favorite preachers?
Yeah.
Either still walking the earth or no longer walking the earth.
Sure. First thing I would say is I had met Reverend Taylor, Dr. Taylor, and I asked him to say a prayer for me as I began here. But I would say for me, James Forbes, who actually is going to be coming to town in April from Riverside.
He's coming here.
Coming to the Divinity School to do the Martin Luther King lectures in April. And
put that on the calendar. We got to get him on Left of Black.
Yeah, he's coming through. And I would say, because he comes out of the Pentecostal tradition, but yet crossed over these denominational traditions and, various expressions.
And the years that he was at Riverside, I mean, just the history of that church.
Exactly.
Right. I mean,
Exactly. So James Forbes would be one. Going back further, I would say Howard Thurman, who
long time.
He's one of my mentors in writing. Just thinking about his also crossing these borders. I mean, but a Baptist minister, but a very different kind of Baptist minister.
Who also functioned in a certain kind of way at a white elite university.
First Black dean at Marsh Chapel at Boston University.
Yeah.
And so I'm eating his material these days to try to glean something. Obviously, I mean, I would say Martin Luther King Jr., Dr. King, and rings true. And I mean, who cannot hear his voice and not be moved or touched in some way? But those are three preachers, I would say, that have influenced me. There's also a man, my own father is a minister in his own way.
Of course.
So I want to highlight that. Another gentleman, Floyd Tompkins, who was Associate Dean of Religious Life at Stanford University when I was an undergrad. Another Baptist-costal who actually was at Princeton University before as in that same role, but really had a huge impact on my life. And so those are some of the individuals, I would say.
You're watching Left of Black. We're here with Dean Luke Powery, who's the Dean of the Chapel here at Duke University, the author of the recent book, Dem Dry Bones, Preaching Death and Hope. Given everything that we've seen in 2012, a series of mass shootings, an incredibly contentious presidential election, if not just a contentious political environment in general. When we talk about gun violence, what we've seen in cities like Chicago, as we've seen drone attacks abroad, what do you say, what would you say to the American public looking forward into 2013. Again, preaching death and hope.
Yeah.
What do you say to the public, from your vantage,
Sure.
thinking about 2013?
Sure. Ooh, what a great question. I do say that we have to tell the truth about the vast domain of death and that has been and still is, as it relates to violence of any kind, to name it. And but I also want to offer the expression of lament as a possibility of response. That lament itself is not an expression that is hopeless, but it actually embedded in the very nature of lament, as I'm thinking of it from the mode of the Psalms, embedded in the very nature of lament is in the crying, the anguish, the questioning, is hope. Because they are cried out, voiced to a God who is present, even being crucified on lynching trees. So I would say lament is a way forward. But I would also say that we have to come to a place where we begin to reflect. Even my mode of discourse, preaching, is a nonviolent discourse.
Yeah.
And so one fights with words and not with weapons of any kind, because there is, even though we can kill others with words, right? Words can hurt, but there's a sense that we have to come to affirming each other's humanity. I think if whether we're black, we're white, we're Latino, Asian of some, there's a sense that before we are whatever label, we are human beings. And to begin to affirm one another's humanity is a starting place for whatever conversations may occur with gun control and gun violence and talking about mental health.
Yeah.
And these to affirm one another's humanity. I believe that might be a fruitful way forward, and a way that may provide hope in this time of tragic deaths.
We've been joined this afternoon by Dean Luke Powery, who is the new dean of the chapel at Duke University, the first black minister to hold that position. He's also a professor of the practice of homiletics in the Divinity School here at Duke University, and the author of the new book, Dem Dry Bones, Preaching Death and Hope. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon, Dean Powery.
No, thank you. Pleasure is all mine.
Yeah. Eric, you're a real life G for this one. Yeah. All black everything. All black, All black in the name of all my black heroes. All black everything. All black polos. All black medallions, yeah. All black, say. All black everything.